Do we have an obligation to love our family first before we love others? Or are we supposed to love others just the same as we love our family? This is the question that Mike Tolliver, our executive director, is going to work on for his PhD thesis. And so today we kind of talk about how he's developing that thesis, a little bit about how academics works, how do books come from ideas, how do those get worked out in academics, and then how do those get turned into books. But fascinating work on Sophie's choice, which child do you send to the Nazis when you love both of them as a family member? And then how do we deal with stranger love, like that we should love the foreigner and love the stranger, and the Good Samaritan story? How do we deal with all of that in light of the fact that there is this kind of unique role of family love in the Bible? Stay tuned for more on that. I think the question I would ask you particularly would be, you've done a lot of research, like you've got 3 master's degrees, right? So why do you want to do more? Like, what's the thing in you that makes you want to go further?
Yeah, well, that is a good question. So when I did those initial master's degrees, I was burning hard in pursuit of a PhD in biblical studies. Now, I didn't know at the time that there's a distinction to be made between biblical studies, theology, systematic theology, let's say, and then, of course, there's this distinction between theology and philosophy. But just broadly, I was thinking, like, if I want to have a career teaching the Bible, like, it's got to be biblical studies. So I was kind of running down that track, and at the time, it made sense actually to pause on those future studies and then pursue a career with business development broadly. You could also say entrepreneurship or any number of different titles.
Starting companies.
Starting businesses, yeah. And that was what I chose to do, which was kind of what my undergrad was in. In hindsight, I'm very, very glad that I did that, because while I was pursuing those opportunities in business, I actually ended up with the opportunity to continue academic work as an adjunct and sort of keep a toe in that world. And it wound up actually being my philosophy degree that I got to, kind of continue engaging in that. So I've taught, over the last decade, various forms of applied ethics, ethics of intellectual property, business ethics, ethics in society, and biomedical ethics. So all these different, like, how do we behave in these different sectors of life? And that has always really appealed to me, because even on the biblical studies side of things, I really focused in on Torah. That was right. Where I was at, which is the ethical core of Christianity. So I have always really enjoyed that work. And over the course of, over a decade of doing entrepreneurship and being involved in the academic world, kind of just with a toe in, began asking the question, and had a friend at church who was also an entrepreneur, and we would bounce big life decisions off of one another. Began praying about what would it look like for me, who has all these different interests in all these different directions, to have one opportunity that sort of made use of all these gifts and interests. And so I was like, that's a really good question. I should kind of run down that track. And so I spent maybe about a month building a strategic plan for a nonprofit that would, do all these different things, combining all these different interests. And as I was putting that strategic plan together, one of the things that you do is you take a look at the landscape and see what's there, to identify if there's opportunities for your specific business or nonprofit to meet a need that is not currently being met. And as I was developing that, more and more I kept saying, like, oh, well, the Center for Hebraic Thought would be a good partner in this. Or, man, Dru's already doing this with the Center for Hebraic Thought. And as I was like filling out the strategic plan, I was like, I should just reach out to the Center for Hebraic Thought.
Right.
And, that was when you and I got connected, and, that was about a year ago. So in terms of, doing additional study then, it would be with the idea of essentially enhancing my work with the center. That's the real interest point at this time, is so that I would know better what are the things that are at stake in academia, what are the places that we can meet needs. So like I said, in many ways, it's the marrying of those two interests is why I would like to continue on. I'll probably always continue to teach as an adjunct. I don't know that I would see myself going full-time, although, if an institution were to offer me a full-time position, I'd evaluate it at that point. But I'm not like actively applying.
You have to decide whether you want to take a pay cut.
I've already done that, Drew.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's always interesting to me. There are a couple areas of life vocationally that are very mysterious. I think academia is one of them. Hollywood is another. Publishing, whether it's in academic publishing or otherwise, there's just a lot of like behind the doors decision making going on, and it's hard to tell what's going on. Even when I worked as an adjunct professor, it didn't really, it helps you sharpen your teaching skills, but it doesn't prepare you for the social topography of academia. And it doesn't prepare you for doing a PhD in the way that, I had a big question when I was going into my PhD, like, am I actually physiologically going to be capable of keeping my brain on one topic for a few years and just like working out that one issue? I was a little worried that I was going to get distracted, and it turned out it was just fine. I had no problem going down a deep well and like having to pull myself out every once in a while to see what sunlight looked like. But I wonder, for you, is there a particular deep well that you want to get this one thing straightened out that creates, I guess, a cascade for other things to become more clear as well?
Yeah. So I'll say, like, over the years, as I've studied various topics, there's occasionally been things where I'll come across and I'm like, this goes deeper than I can go right now. I need to put a pin in this and come back to it. And about 5 years ago, a big thing happened. You might have heard of it, COVID. But at that time, two things happened that were unrelated to COVID that had me really want to, at the time I put a pin in it, but now I'm like really wanting to dive into it. And those two things were, I became a father. And the second was, I was on the board of a nonprofit that worked with families and churches in the Mid-Atlantic region to support them for adopting and fostering. And they, knowing my background, they had a position paper that they would present to families and churches on, the calling of adoption, we'll say. And they asked me to, evaluate that, spruce it up, just make sure that they weren't erring into heresy, which, I appreciate that drive at least. But as I began researching through that, I came to what at the time for me was a pretty startling conclusion that I didn't really know what to do with, but I knew I needed to come back to it at some point. And that startling conclusion was, with my work in Torah and approaching the topic of adoption, I was struck by the fact that as beautiful an act as adoption can be, that the social safety net of the kinsman-redeemer in ancient Israel is a far superior practice. The implications of that, like I knew at the time, were significant, but I didn't really know what to do with that. And so seeing how far that could reach, that's like, this is a deep well and I need to go there. And as I've done just like a cursory bit of research so that I could put together a proposal that would then hopefully be accepted by a program, this thing called storge love, family love, it's the Greek word for family love, that I would say kind of underwrites this kinsman-redeemer role. It has all but vanished in the literature that's currently out there. And so I think it would be, interesting to study. I think it would be an important voice to add to that academic research. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it spawns so many different questions, but one of them, just really quick, is has that focus on kinsman, what you're calling kinsman-redeemer, is it in place of or replaced with nuclear family as the kind of the center of the universe, or something else? And maybe define really quickly what you mean by kinsman-redeemer.
Sure. That's important. So in ancient Israel, the kinsman-redeemer was simply you can use the phrase next of kin. All right, and they would serve certain roles, and there was a number of roles that was actually spelled out in Torah. So they would do things like if your brother died and your wife was now a widow, then you would take the widow as your wife so that you could propagate and continue the name of your brother through their heirs. Orphans would be cared for by the next of kin, the kinsman-redeemer. Your poor brother, you were supposed to support financially as the kinsman-redeemer. There was one other.
You could redeem property that was sold off, purportedly due to poverty. A kinsman-redeemer could come buy that property back on your behalf.
Correct.
You had to sell it in a moment of financial weakness. Yeah.
And then another big one is the avenger of blood. So, you're in the woods and your axe head flies off and kills your neighbor. Well, you now have the choice of staying and taking your chances with the avenger of blood, who is the next of kin, who has a right for an eye over you, or you can flee to the city of refuge and wait for the high priest there to die. And so there's this even retributive justice aspect, or restorative justice, if you prefer that term, aspect to the kinsman-redeemer. So it's a robust practice, but it's all based on kinship, like I said, that next of kin principle.
It also, I have this book on law coming out, so this is figured obviously very strongly in that. I'm arguing based on some Bedouin principles that it also extends protection. The fact that this exists then kind of puts a broad shield of protection over people who might otherwise be. So a woman by herself out in a field is actually protected because the guys who are looking at her know she has a father and brothers who will come hunt them down. Dinah had her brothers. She thought she might have had her father, but turns out her father was kind of a putz in that field. And so that it has this kind of pro-social protective effect as well. I was going to say prophylactic, which would be technically the correct term, but it distracts people.
Sure. That's exactly right. And so this robust practice, if ideal Israel practices it as ideal Israel ought, then you've essentially eliminated the social exposure of widows and orphans. That category does not exist. So that is why I view it as such a superior practice to the practice of adoption, which is purely voluntary. If a kid is lucky enough to be adopted, just from the perspective of the child, there is this tremendous uncertainty, I think, in your status as an orphan. Whereas in ancient Israel, again, if Israel's doing what Israel ought, then there is no uncertainty in that regard.
On a good day.
Right.
If Israel had ever done what they were supposed to do, right?
Yeah.
Or the church, yeah. Hey there, if you've benefited from this content at all, please hit the like and subscribe, or subscribe and like, one of those, or both of them together on this video. It helps us tremendously with the math algorithm nerd monsters. So that's good thumbnail. This idea that can come to help. Is it any different in your estimation? Now we're saying you haven't done the research. You've done this kind of preliminary research. You have lots of intuitions. As these things go, when you get down the path of the PhD, many of your intuitions solidify, become more crystallized as you understand the concrete instances that fit them well. And then there's surprising things where you're like, oh, I'd never thought of that, but it now starts to shape your opinion. So we'd expect that to morph and change and solidify in some ways over time. But is there some way in which, like my grandparents and it's my grandma and her brothers, they all moved out to the country from the city of St. Louis out to Winsville back in the 50s, and they all built houses next to each other.
Yep.
And they kind of, the old fashioned, they looked out for one another, and they took care of one another, and they all came up from the Depression. They all lived during the Depression, right? And they knew what it was like to really, really suffer, and they kind of built a little street there where they were always going to have a family looking out for them. Is that essentially what you're talking about, or is there something thicker to the notion?
Well, I think, so there's the kinsman-redeemer specific. That is a specific set of practices that served as, again, I keep using this phrase, social safety net. But right. If you were to dive into the social sciences, you would see again and again and again how close kin relationships have an economic impact, immediate economic impact. A lot of those.
This is the if you don't have anybody in your family who could lend you $2,000 like on the fly, your chances of like going to jail, becoming bankrupt, everything else are like way higher, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And a lot of the research, I don't know if you've seen I know him, Anthony Bradley. I think you know him as Tony. He's been putting out a lot of stuff just on outcomes for boys and girls in one-parent versus two-parent homes.
Right.
And so there's just like, again and again and again, the importance of not just the nuclear family. And I want to kind of broaden our perspective beyond that, because the role of the clan in ancient Israel was actually a significant thing. And I would argue that their society was ordered around a clan-based system, of which the home features prominently, but it's not this like insular, post-industrial revolution nuclear family that we're talking about. It's very much an interconnected system of broad family connections. But all that to say, to get back to your question, the kinsman-redeemer is one practice of a broader category that I would refer to as Storge love. And so if you're familiar with C.S. Lewis's Four Loves, Storge is one of them, and it is this broader category of family love as it plays out in many different circumstances. And so I think that's really where I'd like to kind of camp, is on Storge more broadly. But let me give you an example of some of the questions that come up as Storge is demonstrated specifically in the kinsman-redeemer role, because this rabbit hole goes deep. So let's go back to this position paper that I was researching for that nonprofit. Paul really likes the analogy of adoption for what happens with the inclusion of the Gentiles into God's redemptive work.
I was literally just having lunch an hour ago with Aaron Heim, who wrote the monograph on Paul's metaphor of adoption.
Yeah, it's a great metaphor. It is entirely appropriate for what God has done there. But if you know Torah and you know the role of the kinsman-redeemer, and you know that Paul knew this term,
right,
and he chose to use adoption instead of the kinsman-redeemer, what does that choice tell us? Again, my intuition is that it would have been inappropriate for Paul to apply the kinsman-redeemer to the inclusion of the Gentiles into God's redemptive work.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah.
And so this concept of Storge, family love as a binding agent, being a perfectly natural expression, in human relationships, then there's some aspect of this Storge love that does apply in the kinsman-redeemer role that might not, in some way, apply in the adoption of the Gentiles. And so that's that's really interesting to me, and I would really like to explore that.
Yeah, let me home in on that to make sure everybody understands, because I get where you're going here, but make sure it's
Sure.
clear to everybody that in Aaron Heim's book, again, it's a technical book, it's a monograph, so I wouldn't recommend it for everybody, but her work basically is showing that it's not adoption the way we understand it. I mean, I adopted 2 children, my brother and sister are adopted. It's kind of seen as this generous act of a couple that is called, as you say, to do this. And it's got all adoptions happen in the context of some kind of a family trauma or an individual trauma. So it's got all kinds of lovely things despite all kinds of difficulties that go along with it, just like regular biological children. But Paul is using what Aaron argues is a more Roman metaphor of adoption, which is not really a generous act. It's more like a logistical act where you bring in somebody because you need someone to basically take over the family, take over the business, someone to offer sacrifices to the Roman gods after you're dead on your behalf. But either way, you can take either of those models, the modern one, which probably doesn't fit exactly with what Paul was talking about, or the ancient one. And neither of those are kinsman-redeemer, right?
Right.
They're actually focusing on the strangeness of the relationship, that it's somebody from the outside being brought in to serve a purpose within that family rather than a natural extension of the natural family. Is that right?
That's 100% correct.
Okay.
And so there's something about the nature of God's relationship to the Jews and God's relationship to the Gentiles that makes the analogy of adoption appropriate in relation to the Gentiles. And this gets spicier the further you go down this.
Some of the implications here.
Right. So I'll pose another question. Again, this is where I would like my research to go. To kind of highlight just how far we can run with this. It is amazing how much effort the New Testament authors go through to not make the analogy between circumcision and baptism. I mean, they look everywhere but the practice of circumcision.
Should the Presbyterians turn off their radios now, or?
No. And then, getting a little autobiographical here. The reason why, because I used to be Reformed Baptist, Credo Baptist in my view, for exactly this reason.
Right.
The reason why I am now a Paedo-Baptist is actually because of 1 Corinthians 10, where, again, one of those backflips that Paul does to not make the analogy with circumcision is he actually pulls in Second Temple literature in 1 Corinthians 10, and he says, okay, so when Israel passed through the waters of the Red Sea parting, that was their baptism, and when they ate and drank from the spiritual rock, that was communion. And it was just in passing, I read a commentator who his point wasn't even about this. He's just musing. And he says, for those who reject paedobaptism, the baptism of infants,
right.
When Paul makes this analogy to the Israelites crossing through the waters of the Red Sea, how many of their infants do you think they left on the side of Egypt because they couldn't confess?
Right.
And that wrecked my world, right?
Yeah.
So that's why. But again, it's because Paul uses a good analogy, but it's not circumcision.
Right. Where it would be very easy for him to pull circumcision.
Super easy.
There. Yeah. Okay.
And so there's some sense in which circumcision must not be fitting for a condition where you have Jews and Gentiles in the redemptive work of God together. And so I suspect that there is some element of this Storge love at work behind why that particular analogy is not fitting.
Yeah.
And I have one more if you really want to go there.
Yeah, this is great. I mean, I think all the biblical studies people are hooked in at this point.
Okay.
I want to see where you're going. So.
Okay, so I presented a paper at, remember I kept my toe in the world of academia over these years, and I presented a paper last year at the Rutgers Analytic Theology Conference, or seminar. They like rats. That's their acronym. So I was a rat, last year. And that particular paper was on the the special election of ethnic Israel. Okay? And the entire point, I'll just, cut right to the chase, is that the incarnation, death, and resurrection of Jesus as a Jewish man underwrites the election of ethnic Israel. Because in some way, some meaningful way, if resurrection is the right word for what actually happens, the God of the universe, by virtue of the hypostatic union between the divine and human persons, is Jewish. So there's a kinship relationship here.
Right. So you're getting into the metaphysics of Storge at this point.
Yes. Oh, yes.
What is the actual divine relationship of Jewishness to humanity?
Yep.
Wow. That does get pretty spicy.
Yeah.
And this will equally offend some Jewish people.
Yeah.
And certainly some Christians as well. Okay.
Which is ironic to a certain degree, because in some ways it's an exceptionally high view of the election of Israel. So,
it's not just exceptional, it's like a very specific inroad into election. So that election doesn't just be well, why did God choose them, right? But it actually extends from creation. I would assume creation is going to be involved here all the way through. Those genealogies in Genesis 1 through 11 all of a sudden become way more important in a new way, right? So
actually, throughout the book of Genesis, I think it's very, very focused on the kinship relationships. And it's kind of fascinating that this redemptive promise has a genealogical component. Throughout Genesis, they're constantly asking, why Abraham and not Lot? Why Jacob and not Esau? Why Isaac and Ishmael? So it's constantly throughout this question of, right, but if it's this propositional truth, if it is merely this purpose, instrumental use, which a lot of Protestants love to equate the election of Israel to a merely instrumental use,
right.
It could be anybody. The question in Genesis is not, why not Melchizedek?
Right.
Right? So it's just which of these descendants does that promise flow through? And for some reason, descendancy seems to matter. And Luke picks that up par excellence. Yeah. So anyway.
Yeah, so if you ran the tape of history back, it would still be Israel every time.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I can already hear editors at publishers going like, ooh, that would make a really good book. Which means it has to be a dissertation first, right?
Correct.
Because you got to hammer out all the details and you got to put it under all the requisite scrutiny. And you just need to have that fun time of like getting to soak and sink in and read all the different people who are going to be skeptical of this as well, or tools that are going to help you along the way. Okay, so we talked about this discussion is part of kind of, we see part of our work here in the world is pulling back the curtain on how some things work. We just talked to Matt Whitman, this YouTube, I'm sure he would hate this term, but a YouTube influencer. He is. I mean, he has millions and millions of views, and he really knows what he's doing, and he's very good at it. And I mean that in like a Christian way. Like he's doing really good work. And he takes it very seriously. And now we're talking to you, somebody who is on their way. You're only 3 masters in, right? So
yeah.
Only like a combined, 8 years of graduate school.
Some flavor
looking
of that.
Forward to a few more years. So I guess the question is, how do you go forward from here? Like, what's the next steps in your mind that you need to be doing? I know what happens once you get into a PhD. I kind of know how it's going to go from there. But like, what are you doing with your family, with your time, how you prepare yourself for getting to the next phase beyond these kind of intuitions that you have about how this is going to work? By the say, very well qualified and researched intuitions. It's not like you're just speculating here.
Thank you for saying that.
Yeah.
So, my understanding of what comes next, and this comes from the perspective of someone who's never done it, is that I need to put together a proposal to submit to a program. Just thinking about my family and where we're at, there's probably not a lot of opportunity to pick them up and relocate them. I have two, small kids at home, and that's just not something that we're in a place where we feel strongly about doing. So a PhD program that has a non-residency, aspect to it, to kind of focus where we're at. But then also, looking at, because again, I see this as enhancing my work with the center. So if this has an opportunity for us to build relationships with a program for future scholars, because we absolutely want to equip other scholars in Hebraic thought. So if there's an opportunity to do that, that would really sort of hone which programs I would submit application to. And I think, you and I have talked about one or two that would check all those boxes. So it really is kind of, I'm at that step where I need to actually sit down and put together a proposal, when I have a free minute, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And proposals are painful, especially the British variety where, you try to weasel it down to, whittle. You could weasel it as well.
Yeah.
Depends on how squirmy it is.
Sure.
Down to, a few paragraphs that you can send in an email so that everybody can just get a clear. It's a very hard thing where of course, you have a degree in analytic philosophy, so this is where that helps. Getting something down to a few paragraphs where when someone reads it, they can both kind of catch the hook of the idea and also get some sense that, like, does this person actually know what they're talking about, right? Or can they just write a good hook, because journalists write very good hooks. They don't always have the research to back up, that's not a slagging off of journalists. That's just, you can write a very good hook and not have any depth to it. So you have to show that you've done some of the reading, you've read the right folks, and now you're ready for the next step. And then that gets to formal proposals. But even formal proposals, you get it to 1,000 words.
Sure.
Which you can imagine how fun that is, just picking the right 1,000 words, feeling like your whole future hangs on this moment. And then I guess I'm interested just in the approach, because you've called it Storge. That's kind of the hook that you've hung it on. You're at the Center for Hebraic Thought. You think of this as Hebraic Thought, and yet you chose the Greek term rather than the Hebrew term. So why the Greek term?
Excellent. All right, let's go there. So word studies, and you and I have, joked about how just the limits of a word study. Let's put it that way. And what is that game that you can play that you're allowed to say any word but the word itself, and you're trying to get... No.
It's I don't know. I know what you're talking about.
It's catchphrase.
Oh,
and the reason this is fun...
You've actually done this to me before.
I've done this to you before.
I should have done.
The reason this is a fun question is because I'm literally playing the game catchphrase while I'm trying to get you to tell me about the game catchphrase. But it is to say that all the time we do this where we can talk about a thing without ever using that word. And so in some sense, what we're doing is we're going back into the Hebrew Bible, is we're looking for them talking about Storge without ever using that word. Now, I have done a very cursory word study on Storge. Storge, the word itself, never appears in the old, the Greek translation of the Old Testament or the New Testament. It does appear in the Second Temple literature. It's in Sirach and, the Greek of Sirach and Third and Fourth Maccabees. So, you're going deep to get there.
That's a rather odd cluster.
It is.
Literature, yeah.
It is. I suspect, and again, I've not done this research, and it would be fascinating to learn. So if there's anybody out there who has done this, I think the dates of when those books are written is instructive. So I'm curious how much even in the Greek there was the use of that term before like 150 BC. So that's an intuition. Again, I don't know that. But astorgos, so the lack or opposite of storge, that is in the New Testament. Paul uses it twice in Romans 1:31 and 2 Timothy 3 something.
Wow.
Right? And it's in his list of just the like abominations
Right.
of the non-Christians. Okay?
Wait, is this generally translated hating one's family or?
Okay, so I had to do a little bit of research on that because the ESV translates this very, very poorly. The HCSB actually gets this a little better, and the ESV translates it as
Despising one's family or something like that?
no. I don't even think they bring family into it.
Oh,
Specifically, the word astorgos.
okay.
But the HCSB at least translates it unloving.
Okay. Not insolent. That's not one of the words. Okay, unloving.
But yeah, HCSB gives it unloving. And so it's this idea of, and I think if you were to look it up in the concordance or whatever, it would tell you it's a lack of natural love is the way that they would phrase it. So these people are so wicked that even that thing that is most natural to us, they don't even do that.
The
right?
love of mother and father or something.
Yeah. But what's fascinating about those two particular lists is that Paul is framing these things that the ultimately wicked people do as a complete and total violation of the Ten Commandments.
Right.
And so there is some sense in which the violation of the Ten Commandments puts you in a place where you are violating storge love.
Right.
So then let's think about this. Which of those 10 commandments might display storge love without ever using that word?
I'm gonna guess number 5.
Number 5 is like
the
in your
Protestant
face.
count, at least, yeah.
Yeah. But honor your father and mother, right? And what's interesting is it's not just this like do this, don't do this, do this, don't do this. There's appendages on some of these, right? And if memory serves, the fifth commandment, honor your father and mother, is tied to your long life in the land.
Right. Let me go with you. Live long in the land of the living. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So there's some sense in which the storge love empowers your continued economic prosperity, and sure enough, we see that the land ownership system, which is probably better referred to as a land stewardship system,
right,
is kinship based.
Yep.
Okay, so that kind of intimately ties these things together. But I would argue that there's several other of the Ten Commandments that have storge either explicit or baked in, like in those like trails.
Adultery.
That's right. We tend to think of that merely as misordered eros.
Right.
Which is true. But there is a
Eros
palpable
in the sense of erotic love for somebody other than your spouse or somebody else's spouse. Yeah.
Thank you for
not all of you for those of you who hadn't read the Four Loves recently.
Yes, correct. And so, right, adultery destroys families, and so at risk is this binding principle of social structures of human nature. When you commit adultery, you are destroying your family, right? And so that's in there as well. But then also, like I said, it's baked into some of these other of the Ten Commandments. And I think the one that I've been thinking about most powerfully recently is the second commandment, where this right worship, right, doing worship rightly, has a negative effect, right? If you get it wrong, to the third or fourth generation, and if you get it right, to the 1,000th generation. And so there's this beautiful picture that God gives baked into the second commandment of legacy that is just rich in storge there. And we could talk, several of the others do that as well, like that different aspects of Storge is kind of baked into it.
Seems to me too that the opposite of the fifth commandment, honor your mother and father, is also given in very vivid description. And the one who curses their parents is to be put to death, right? To be brought before the elder by their parents and put to death. And it specifically says if he will not listen, right? So he curses and is incorrigible towards their parent. It's in that kind of same way that it just, like, what's one thing you can absolutely do to tear your family apart? hate your parents and don't listen to them and be incorrigible like that. That will do the damage as well. So yeah, I can think of lots of areas, and even a lot of neighbor love in the Hebrew Bible is ultimately going to be connected to, like, neighbors are going to be kin often, right? Mm-hmm. So it's on the liminal boundary there of any neighbor language as well.
Yeah.
Now I wonder what you do, speaking of neighbors, what you do with all of the stranger love in the Torah, or the foreigner love.
Yeah, great question. So what I would get out of the way at the start is that there is no moral dilemma here. And I would probably have to do a lot of research with specific cases to highlight that. But what I mean is, Storge love should never prevent stranger love.
Right. So it's not love my family over and above loving people outside of my family.
Correct. And I think that's the thing that most people get really concerned about whenever I talk about this. Mm-hmm. And I've started connecting with other folks about this, bring it out into community. And that's probably the primary pushback that I get, is this worry that if Storge love is somehow true and somehow powerful, that it forces you to devalue the stranger. And I just don't see that at work in Torah. I think that it's okay for us to talk about privileging relationships, but simply because a relationship is privileged doesn't mean that you devalue other relationships. And it was actually in your interview with Shai Held.
Right. This came up.
He talked about this, and I loved what he said. And maybe others have said it too, but he was the first to say it that I heard it. Is that what God is doing with love in the Bible goes with the grain of nature.
Right.
And I love that, and I would use that phrase as well. So I'm highlighting these natural relationships that we're born into, where love ought to be.
Right.
It isn't always, and we can talk about that, but simply because that is the natural relationship that we are given, where love is to be found, doesn't mean that alleviates us of any other loving relationships or anything along those lines.
Yeah, and even that's already a controversial statement. I mean, I agree with you, and Shai as well, but his position, it sounds like the one you're developing here, is that loving Storge love is actually training for extending that love out. Where you can, of course, I'm thinking of the evolutionary thinking now that says, no, clans hunker down and they only protect their own because of that special bond that they have with one another. There actually is now a larger field of cooperative natural selection that says maybe competition and hunkering down wasn't actually all there was to the story. And so when we talk about what is natural for humans, even early humans, if you think of Göbekli Tepe or 100,000 years before that, you have human groups running around the earth, and maybe it was natural for humans to extend their love and care and concern for people who were not of their clan, in the right, when they weren't trying to kill you, and in the right appropriate circumstances. So, so love in Storge becomes love. Preparation for love beyond, right? Which is how it seems how Jesus interprets the Torah, right? Like, if you had loved within Israel properly, then you should know how to extend this out.
Yeah, that's a good way to say it. Now, I mentioned that phrase "moral dilemma" years ago. I heard a sermon that gave this thought picture, and it's basically a variation on Sophie's choice. If you're familiar with that ethical, it is a
Mother
moral
choosing
dilemma.
one child to go die to the Nazis, right? So.
Right. You choose one child to live, you have two children. If you don't choose one to live, we'll kill them both. So it forces this choice, which pits parental love against parental love, right? That's the idea. That's what's going on. So this analogy that this pastor used to open his sermon illustration was a fisherman goes out to sea with his son and his son's friend, and a storm comes upon them. The fisherman is a Christian, his son is a Christian, and the friend is not. And this storm comes upon the sea, throws both boys out of the boat, and the fisherman has one rope and an opportunity to save one. And then he goes on throughout the sermon.
Where I think it's going.
It's going exactly where you think it's going. And so, he goes through the meat of the sermon, right? We're all on the hook.
Were you there listening to the sermon?
I was there. I had to listen. I'm in the congregation. And so he makes it through his whole sermon, and then he wraps it up right at the end and says, so the fisherman throws the rope to his son's friend because he knew his son would die and be with him in heaven. But this boy needed the rope. And that's what Jesus does for you, is he gives you, there's this cathartic moment for everybody on the edge of their seats. But what he's essentially doing is he's creating a moral dilemma where he pits these two kinds of love against one another, and he forces on the congregation the entirely unnatural choice.
Right.
And then he pietizes that.
Right.
Right? So, all that to say, I take some issue with that.
Yeah. Especially that last move where making it the spiritual choice, the spiritually correct choice is to do that thing that goes against instinct in some way. So I think what I hear you doing is saying, that kind of family loyalty instinct is actually good and true so far as it goes but there is, kind of a via media here. Like there's some line that it crosses where it can be too isolated, nuclear family, too unnatural that you don't have those bonds, or you have this weird spiritualism where you just say, no, it's to go against every, to George Costanza, the whole thing, just go against every natural instinct you've ever had. And that there actually is some tension held middle, and I guess the part of your project is going to be developing, what are the nodal points that hold the tension?
Correct, yeah. So just like we talked about misordered eros, I think that there can be misordered storge as well. The obvious one is incest. We could throw that out. But, people, I think, typically exclusively regard nepotism in a negative light. Right. So that might be another malformed storge. I think that there can be good forms of nepotism.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
As a matter of fact, I think the description of the kings in ancient Israel, it's a desire for rightly ordered, well-practiced storge, and so often that goes awry. But just because something goes awry doesn't mean it's bad.
Right.
Necessarily. So you're absolutely right. We definitely need to develop what is that rightly ordered and then that misordered. And if you want to do like Aristotelian categories, you could probably misorder in either direction.
Right.
But yeah.
And, process-wise, what this looks like is you do a PhD, which means you read a lot of books and you write and rewrite and rewrite. And then that creates what we call the dissertation, or in the UK they call it the thesis. They call it an undergraduate dissertation, and they call the PhD the thesis, and we do the
it's
opposite.
Like exactly backwards, yeah.
And so you do that monograph. But nobody here who's listening to this will be able to read that unless they want to download it for free and slug their way through it, because it's written to a very small group. Like, you write books towards audiences, and anybody who says their book is for everybody doesn't understand anything about writing.
That's right.
And so for a PhD, your audience is basically 5 or 6 people. And then the next step would be to get it published either as a technical monograph, which means the audience is about 500 people,
Yes.
or make it a kind of a general academic book, which means, you could go to a couple thousand people, or then a trade book, which means you could rewrite the whole thing in language that anybody can understand. And then, that could be tens of thousands of people. And so when we think about published resources, we often think about, okay, if somebody's got a monograph, they wrote a PhD, they translated that into a technical book, great. Nobody who goes on the biblical mind can understand most of it.
Sure.
So maybe we get that author to write a short, simplified, translate it. So it's not just they dumb it down. They actually translate it over into what normal people can understand. And so I think I hear everything you're saying. I was like, okay, there's about 12 articles you could write that could be translated, that can come through the door of a particular problem, like the fisherman and the two kids.
Right.
That's a great opening story for a chapter, So, and that's, if you ever wondered where do we get all these people who interact with us and create stuff for the Center for Hebraic Thought, it's people like you who've been through this process, and this is how they've been formed and shaped. And this is why we trust them as well, right? Is because like you, I can push back, and you've got something below the surface that you can pull up and say, oh yeah, I've thought about that, and here's how it works, right? Not shutting down, and obviously you're not trying to shut down questioning, but there's more than just I had an idea and I think this is how this works, right? Which is why it's a little frustrating when people critique an article. They think this is all the person has. Right? Like
Sure.
Some speculation that somebody came up, and you're like, no, they can read more. All right, well, Mike, this is fascinating. I think a lot of people will be interested in this. I think it's actually the conversation that is on the horizon for people who have Gen Z kids and below, because I think we're headed back more towards a larger intergenerational family focus. But we don't have any nodes to help us understand where that can go awry or not. So I think there can be some very prophetic and prescient guidance that even your PhD research can play out just in regular families, and hopefully correct a lot of bad sermons.
Well, that would be wonderful. Yeah, thank you.
All right. Thanks, Mike.
All right, thank you.